absolutely. All right. Yes. Swell to be well. Let me tell you. Thank you. Before I start, I want to invite you all to be initiated into the tribe of Narcotics Anonymous. Since we're out here in the woods, and this is, Indian country, and what I want you to do is, you're going to have to follow me. It's a small little initiation ritual, and I'm sure y'all want to be a part of, right? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, you got to stand up. Okay. Now, here we go. Now you got to put your hands up like antlers, right? By your ears, right? Okay. And you got to turn around once, all the way around. Okay. Now repeat after me. Owa, Tafu, I am. You certainly are. Go back to the other. That's right. Now you noticed I said that with y'all too. A moment of silence for me. Thanks. My name is Kermit, and I'm an addict. I'm clean today through the grace of God and Narcotics Anonymous, and I'm very honored to be here. Very honored. I am always honored to speak in front of a group of people of the caliber that you are, members of Narcotics Anonymous, because I know what kind of courage and strength it takes to stay clean one day. And I applaud that courage and strength. And y'all need to applaud yourselves too. Well, this is wild. I just want to sit here and go, yea, verily I say unto thee, I shall preach the name of Narcotics Anonymous. Amen. That's right. NA's wonders to behold. Yes, sir. And you shall hear wonders tonight. Wonders. I'm telling you. Like Jamise was talking about, I was having a little minor trouble with women. You put 10 of them in a row, I'll pick the sick one every time. I don't know where I learned that. I had this sponsee that would come to me about relationships, and he'd always say, I can't find the right woman around here, and she's just not around here, and I don't know where she is, and I want the right woman, and I just can't find her. And I said, Bill, I've been listening to you for weeks on this stuff, and I'm getting really sick and tired of it. I said, you know what I want you to do? I want you to go home and write down everything that this right woman would have for you. I said, I want, what color hair, what color eyes, what are her likes, what are her dislikes, and I don't want you to come back and talk about this thing until you're done. So he said, well, all right, and he left. And about 2 weeks later, he comes back with this mangled piece of paper, and he hands it to me. He says, here, read it. I said, no, Bill, read it to me. And I said, well, all right. And he said, well, she's got red hair and blue eyes or whatever. She's got a perfect hourglass figure, and she likes to cook and clean, and she's really intelligent, and she's well off financially, and she likes to wake me up with coffee and cigarettes in the morning, and whenever we come in the group, and she's speaking and I come in, she sort of backs off and gives me center stage, and I said, that's a pretty dynamite woman you're describing there, Bill. He said, Well, yeah. I said, now, would a woman like that go out with a shit like you? He said, well, no. I said, the idea is to make yourself into the kind of man that would attract that kind of woman. And I believe my journey through the 12 steps of Narcotics Anonymous have made me into the kind of man that would attract that kind of woman. Kisses. It's my angel. I'll let her tell her story tomorrow. Just the fact that she puts up with me is sainthood, you know? I walked into my first 12-step meeting. It was August of 1979. You know, it dawned on me the other day. I was in a camp out in Alabama, and I was walking down the trail, and I realized that this August I'll have been chasing this recovery thing for almost 20 years. Yeah. A long time, let me tell you. Well, I walked into this treatment center of August 1979, and, you know, I was in there for about 2 weeks, and, you know, when you're in treatment 2 weeks, you're well, you know. And, you know, they sent this little group of well people, they were going to come fix me, right? And they came down the hall. I was there for about 3 or 4 days, and what the well-dressed addict wears, blue pajamas. And, you know, addicts, we're the only creatures that have to pee in a cup to survive. They used to give me those little Dixie cups with the labels on them, you know, and I'd write stuff on them. You know, like, apply to reddened area if itching persists, call your doctor. Gargle twice before meals. Send it down the hall. So this group of well folks came to get me, and they took me down the hall. They said, we're going to go to this alcohol meeting. I said, great. I'm a social chameleon. I can fit in anywhere, you know. Tell me the game plan. And so I walked down the hall, and we sat down in this little meeting room. It was kind of like this, a little smaller, you know, one of them old Formica tables there. And I looked around the room, and it was a little different. It was like these 40 and 50-year-old guys, and they had big red noses and pot bellies out to here, and they were bald back to there. And they said, if you want what we've got. And I said, fuck no! I'd be willing to go to any length not to catch that, whatever it is. I quit drinking for the next 2 years. I went through 2 more treatment centers, strung out on heroin, but I was sober, thank you. Yes, sir. And I started on my merry road to sobriety. I didn't do anything in the treatment center, didn't follow any directions, didn't go to any meetings. I was singing in a new wave punk band and drinking Coca-Colas in the bars just to show you how cool I was, and, you know, relapsed. Went back to the treatment center, you know, I said, I think I need a refresher course. The first time didn't take. They're kind of like the fellowship. They said, we love you, keep coming back, that'll be $10,000. I had to go through 3 treatment centers and spend $30,000 to find out that the meetings were free. Tell it, sister. She's got her hand back. I pity the fool. Well, I was in there for a short period of time. When I met a girl in there, she was in there for drug addiction and other symptoms. I found out what the other symptoms were. You know, it's one thing when you're like 12 years old and your mama comes in on you in the bathroom and you're playing with yourself, but when you're 27 years old and you get caught naked with a girl in a treatment center and you got to go to group and apologize. I'm sorry, I threatened her sobriety. We'll sit on opposite sides of the room. Can we stay? I made it out of that time for about another 30 days, 90 days, I don't remember, you know. Like they talk about relapse. I didn't have any to lapse from, you know. And what started happening was the disease of addiction was progressing, you know. That's what they told me in this treatment center, that I had a disease, that it was chronic, that once I got it, it wasn't going away. and that it was progressive, that over a long period of time it was going to get worse, and that it was fatal. And my disease started to get worse. It was bad enough, but I remember going up to New York. My son had been taken from me. I'd lost my shop, lost the wife. And I remember going up to get my son for the summer. I went up there to my youngest brother's high school graduation, and I got there first, and my mom left her pocketbook out. And it was nothing to slip a bill out, and go into the city like I used to do and get a little package, and they'll never know. And 1 turned to 2, turned to 5, and I ended up nodding out in the front row of my youngest brother's high school graduation. And 11 o'clock at night, my wife who started to, find a little bit of information about this stuff, said to me, you can't have your son. And you know what? I'm tired of telling him. You tell him. So at 11 o'clock at night, I had to tell this 5-year-old boy that he couldn't spend the summer with his dad. And my son looked up to me and he said, well, why, Daddy? I said, well, you can't. I said, well, why not? I said, because I can't stop doing drugs, and it's not your fault. I'm sick. I'm sorry. And he went to my ex and cried, and I went in the bathroom and did what I had to do. And I wandered back to Virginia where I was living, and I got in a relationship with a married woman who liked to do the drugs that I did. And her husband was away out for the weekend, and she invited me to her house. And this poor guy hitchhiked from D.C. all the way to Southern Virginia, climbed this big hill to get to his house, got to the house and climbed up the stairs to the fine sight of me doing it with his wife. And I was a friend of his. He said, "Get out!" And I got out, gingerly. And I went out back, and I sat in my car, and I had all those feelings: self-disgust, remorse, self-pity, shame. And I remember that, I picked up the phone to call my therapist, and I asked him, can I go back to treatment? He said, well, the treatment center won't take you anymore. And I hung up the phone before he could say anything else. And I remember that they had some drug program at the local mental health, and I wandered in there a couple weeks later. And it's the old adage, that when the pupil's ready, the teacher will appear, and God will move you from where you are to where you need to be, and He'll bring the people in your life that you need to be with. And I walked in there, and I asked for a counselor, and they looked down this list, and they said, "Martin, go see Martin tomorrow." And I said, "Okay." And I came back, and I met this guy, Martin, and he said, "Wes?" I said, "Yeah, he's my dealer." He said, "Well, Wes has got 6 months clean." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "And I sent him to a treatment center down at the beach." I said, "Oh, man, I can't go to treatment again." But I didn't have any fight left, And I said, "All right." And they made the arrangements, and they sent me 3 hours across the state of Virginia. I was living in the mountains of Virginia where there was no Narcotics Anonymous. They moved me 3 hours across the state to a treatment center where 30 days before I got there, they started the first NA meeting in that town, in that treatment center. Some people were bringing a message over from Virginia Beach. They were doing H&I. I'm clean today through H&I. And then they put me in, immediately put me in the well-dressed addict uniform, blue pajamas. I immediately noticed when I was there a serious architectural defect in the planning of the building. There was no doorknob on my side of the door. I wanted to let them know. And I was in bad shape. I didn't even want to talk to anybody. I was just growling and twitching for days. They finally let me out, and the group that was well came down the hall to get me, and they said the words that were going to change my life. They said, "Would you like to go to an NA meeting?" And I said, yeah. And I walked down the hall to that meeting, and I sat down, and I looked around the room, and it looked just like us. And I weighed 100 pounds less than I do now, My hair was all matted up. My tooth had cracked in half where I'd bitten in a fork and just crumbled. I was yellow. And I was falling apart. And when I sat down in that chair, I knew the women were checking me out. Yes, sir, regular stud muffin here. And they read out a little white book. They said, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. And I thought, God, they're being kind. You know? And I remember that I was there 21 days. I'll never forget it. They had an NA meeting, and this guy got up to give his talk, an NA talk, right? And back then, you know, there were a lot of war stories, you know? Because the AA people said you go to the NA meetings and talk about drugs. So that's what we did. You know? We went to NA meetings and talked about drugs. And this guy got up and he told this horrible story about killing guys in dope deals. He was a biker, a mean, rough, tough guy, and been in and out of prison. Guy had gone through 11 treatment centers. He had 40 white chips. That's like an outfit, you know, a belt, a choker, you know. And at the end of the meeting, he sat down and they called him back up and they gave him his 1-year medallion. A year, that was forever, you know? And I thought, if that son of a bitch can make it, so can I, you know? Narcotics Anonymous gave me hope, you know? I left the treatment center doing it my way. Not really. They told me I should go to a halfway house, you know? 6 months, 3-time loser, you know? And I went in my bedroom and I got on my knees and talked to that God that I didn't understand and said, what should I do? And this voice came into my head real loud. Do whatever they tell you to, dummy! And then I called on my higher power. I don't know if you know, her name's Patty. I called my girlfriend up. I said, honey, they think I should go to a halfway house for 6 months. She goes, oh, no, you can't do that. I come every day and I cry all the way home and you have to come home. I said, what do I tell him? She said, tell him you've made your mind up. So I went back to group and said, I've made my mind up. And they have one of those super groups, you know, my group and the group next door and all the counselors all trying to get little Kermit to surrender. And they weaseled it out of me, right? I said, if I go to the halfway house for 6 months, she'll leave me and my life won't be worth living. We were married a year later. And 9 months after that, we were annulled, and my life's been great ever since. So much for I thought, right? So that's the way I left treatment, with everybody telling me that I was going to get loaded by nightfall. And basically, they were right, you know? I left that treatment center. I drove from Hampton, Virginia, across the state, through Richmond, I saw a sign that said 7 miles to town, and the disease started talking. And it was loud. We're going to get some dope. We're going to get some money. What kind of story can we tell her? And I was like, we're in a Honda. She's going to hear you. We got back to my best friend's place. I moved out of my brother's place because he was shooting dope. I couldn't stay there. So I moved in with my best friend who was only dealing cocaine. I made a decision. And we got into this basement apartment where he'd thrown a mattress on an empty floor, and I laid down next to Patty, and I started shaking. I was right between the rock and the hard place. I was right in that spot where I was going to do what I always did, which was run, or I was going to try something new. And I turned to her and I said, Patty, all I'm thinking about is where can I get some money and how can I get some dope, and I'm really scared and I don't know how to do this stuff. And she said, well, there's a meeting tonight, and you know, if you have a problem with Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, you weren't there in 1981. That's all there was. And you know, and I said, okay, and I went to the meeting. She got me to the meeting. And I sat down, and in 1981 in the mountains of Virginia, they were not thrilled to see drug addicts in their meeting. And I raised my hand, you know, came to me, and my name's Kermit, I'm a drug addict. And about 3 people said hello. There was as many as in the center section. I mean, that's what I felt. And it came to my turn, you know, and they said to me, I raised my hand. It was around Robin. And I said, all I'm thinking about is how to get high, and I'm really scared. I don't know how to do this stuff. And this little redneck sitting next to me had a shit-eating grin on his face. He's just smiling, He had the answer. He's just smiling. He turns to me. You won't believe this, what he says to me. He says, "Just don't get high today." I said, "Wow, run that by me again. Today?" I said, "Till I go to bed." He said, "Yeah, till you go to bed." I said, "I wonder why I didn't think of that." And I went to bed that night clean. And I woke up the next morning free. And I'm not saying I haven't had a burning desire to use since that day, because I've had some barn burns. But I knew without a shadow of a doubt I never had to use again the rest of my life, one day at a time, in the 12-step meetings. This September I'll be celebrating God's will, 17 years clean in Narcotics Anonymous. As a friend of mine from California says, that may not impress you, but it impresses the hell out of me. I tell you. I went to every meeting I could go to. That was the second half. The next morning I surrendered to the second half of the first step. That my life was none of my business. That's the one I always mixed up. I'd go, I'm powerless, lock me up, and then I'd get in treatment and I'd be there 2 weeks and be well, and I'd be junior counselor. You got to get honest, motherfucker. Sit in them groups, I learned newcomers want to do 3 steps: 1, 9, and 12. I surrender, I sorry, I help you. You get these guys in the treatment center meetings, you do H&I, right? And they're in the front row. They got their hand up through the whole meeting, like, ooh, pick me. And you pick them, you know what they're going to say, right? The guy's going, I've worked my first 3 steps with my sponsor. I've been making amends to my family. I'm getting ready to do my 4th step. These have been the best 2 days of my life. Yes, sir. That was me. I went to every meeting that we had. We had 8 meetings a week. I went to this drug counselor, and after about 4 months, he turned to me and Wes, and he gave us a starter kit and said, "Why don't you go start one of those NA meetings?" I thought, wonder why I didn't think of that. So we started writing letters around town. We wrote letters where they had the AA meetings. We're no dummies, Let's get our foot in somewhere, right? And we'd write this letter, we're a 12-step program based on the tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous, da-da-da. And we get these letters back. We sent out 40 letters, right? And we get these responses, and you could kind of read between the lines, say, the Board of Deacons do not feel that it is prudent at this time, and you can see right between there and say, to have a bunch of drug-shooting junkies in our basement to give you a key, are you crazy? Sincerely, Reverend, we got 1 letter back from this little Cherry Avenue church, and the guy said, yeah. So we got dressed up in suits. It's a program of attraction. And we went to see this guy, right? Me and this tall brother, And we showed up and we told him the deal, and he gave us the key. And man, I was on fire. I was the committee. Let me tell you. I was the H&I committee, the PI committee, the literature committee. The phone line was at my house. I wanted to elect myself WSR, represent the world to God. But there's some people in California already have the position. You can call them up, they'll tell you. I ran around town. I was literature committee, right? I took the who, what, how, why pamphlet and made 100 copies, and that was our literature for 6 months because I was in charge, right? I went to all the treatment centers and gave them a little flyer. Come to our NA meeting. Send addicts to our NA meeting. One. And about 2 weeks before we started the first meeting, we got a call from the treatment center. And this guy says to me, he says, we've got this 14-year-old girl. She's on our 5th floor psych ward. She's been eating speed. She's up here for her 3rd time trying to commit suicide. we don't know what to say to her. Would you come and talk to her? Oh, the big guru, 4 months. What the hell do I know? I said, okay. And, I went up there and they gave us a room and 2 plastic chairs. And, when you have like 13 years of using and 4 months of recovery, what are you going to talk about, right? I told her every nasty, rotten, scummy, disgusting thing I'd ever done in my life for an hour and 20 minutes. And in the last 5 minutes, I said, and I've got 4 months clean and I go to NA and we're starting the next meeting this Wednesday. And she said, okay. So, God bless her mother trusted us to come get her, and we had, when we started that meeting, we had everything you need for a meeting. We had 2 or more recovering addicts and 1 good sick one. Gotta have a good sick one, right? And, Jennifer, her name was Jennifer, and she was having trouble staying clean. She'd go for a few days and eat speed and then go for a few days. And one night after the meeting, I said to her, she said, I just don't understand this, 1 day at a time. I said, well, Jennifer, why don't you not use from tonight's meeting till tomorrow night's meeting? And she said, wonder why I didn't think of that. And this January, Jennifer celebrated 16 years clean in Narcotics Anonymous. We didn't have a basic text, it works, just for today. We had 5 IPs in a white book. We didn't even have any chips, because I was literature committee. I went out and got some poker chips, put little NAs on them, so we had something, And what we had was the therapeutic value of one addict helping another without parallel. And we laugh and we joke about this stuff, but the bottom line is that girl would have been dead if she hadn't have found the message of hope in Narcotics Anonymous. And she graduated college and she got a degree. She married another sponsee of mine. She lives in Richmond. She has sponsees, they have sponsees, and they have sponsees. And she gives back what's so freely given to her. I was trying to work these steps, when you don't have a sponsor and you got about 9 months clean, I figured I must be on step 3. And so I started trying to look for God's will in everything, This was the way I worked my 3rd step, I'd stop at a light and I'd say, okay, there's probably going to be an accident up there and God wants me to stop here so that I don't get run over. And, it's like a napkin would fall off the table. Oh my God, it's a sign from God! But it's the whole deal that when you're willing, God will take care of it. He honors that stuff. And I remember getting into Patty's car. I had 9 months clean, and I got in the car, and there was a letter there from the sheriff's department. I knew they wanted me to speak. And it was a warrant for my arrest. Oh, man. It was for something I know you guys have never done, writing checks knowing there's no funds in the account. And I looked up at the sky and I was so mad, man, because I'd been doing all this NA stuff and I'd been clean and, And I looked up at the sky and said, all right, God, what do you want me to do about this one? And the Beatles song, Let It Be, came on the radio. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. I was like, man, I've heard from the almighty Paul McCartney. I was like, yeah, all right, I'm going to let go and let God, I'm going to turn this problem over to God and act as if he's got it already taken care of and do the next right thing to be done. And that's what I did. I let go of it until the night before court, and then I was a nervous wreck, and then that morning I got dressed up and brought my little recovery book with me and sat in the back row where all the guilty people sit. And whenever I go to court, it's like Richard Pryor says, I went there for justice, and that's what I found, just us. And I always want to go with a stack of white books, 30 days, here, have a white book. Drunk and disorderly, have a white book. And they call my name for the long walk, and I'm God grant us serenity, God grant us serenity, walking up there, and I was willing, And when you're early recovery, you're willing to tell everything. It's like, yes, Your Honor, I did steal those cigarettes out of the cigarette machine at the train station with David Reingold when we were 7 years old. I was going to tell every crime I'd ever done. He didn't want to hear any of it. So I went up there, and the judge goes, he said, Mr. Osborne, he said, you want to tell us something about this check? And I said, well, Your Honor, hi. He said, hold it. And he calls the lawyer over for the supermarket change. He says, Counselor, he says, do you recognize that this check's a year old? And the lawyer said, well, yeah. He said, well, you can't prosecute a man in a criminal case for a check that's a year old. And the counselor says, well, I can't. He said, no. He said, now you can prosecute him in a civil suit and get your money back. He said, unless, Mr. So-and-so, you're here to pay the money you owe. What do you think I said? Yes, Your Honor, that's what I'm here to do. He said, pay the man $32, case dismissed. I've had a deep faith in the God of my understanding ever since that day. And honey, when the music plays, I listen. I listen. I met this guy Larry. We called him the old man. He must have had like 8 or 9 years back then, forever. He was in world everything. He calls me up. He says, "You're in the Blue Ridge area." I said, "Great. What the hell's that?" And he explained about area service. And the Blue Ridge area was the western half of the state of Virginia. Everything from Richmond west was our area, And, if you went to area service, it was 2.5 hour drive, so I know what it's like being out here, And, he said, your group needs to elect a GSR. I said, oh, I can do that. So I elected myself GSR. And he, proceeded to explain that we had 5 pamphlets and a white book. I was with this one IP. And, I started to learn from Larry. I started to learn that if he would say, let's go somewhere, I would learn to say, okay. Because wherever we went, we would meet people like you guys. We would have a great time. I would grow from it, and I would learn new stuff. And I moved down to the beach, trying to save Patty, and got down there, and Larry called and he said, we're going to go to a convention. I said, great, where? He said, Georgia. I was like, wow, we're in Virginia, man, whoa. I said, okay. And I met him at midnight, and we went down to Georgia. And Larry had this old green van that had a steering wheel that you could turn all the way to here and all the way to here, and you're still going straight down the road. And he just loaded this thing full of addicts, full of newcomers. It was like at the circus, you open it up and newcomers would bubble out. And we're driving at like 4 in the morning. I'm a New York Jew, right? I'm sitting here in this green van at 4 in the morning in South Carolina with a redneck cop behind me, a gas truck on my right, and it's pouring rain. And I'm going, God, just get me to Georgia, please. So we got down there, right, and it was a time of change, We, there was this opening meeting on Friday night, and this one guy got up from Michigan, and he said, I didn't hear much last year, but I heard, work the steps or die, motherfucker. And I thought, God, these must be real drug addicts. Because there's nobody talking about the steps at home, because I'm in charge and I ain't worked any. And then a little later, this guy, Motorcycle Ed, gets up and he says, you know what I think that's so cool about this convention? This is a Narcotics Anonymous convention with Narcotics Anonymous speakers. See, that was a novel idea back then. See, all our speakers were clean and sober, addict alcoholics, who were in AA and NA. And there was this thing that was going on that back then. It was a novel idea about only going to NA for your recovery, See, back then, NA was this extra meeting that you went to enhance your AA recovery. It was where you went to talk about drugs. A bunch of addicts get together to talk about drugs, they want to get loaded, A bunch of addicts get together to talk about recovery, they want to stay clean, And it was wonderful, it was powerful, and this was like the time of firsts, It was like First Philadelphia, we'd all get in the car, run to Philadelphia, and it's like, yay, and First New Jersey, we'd run over there, First New York, okay. We went to Tennessee a few months later, and it was like, I'd figured this out, right? I figured out how to be cool, right? What you do is, you go to every meeting, and you put your hand up and get on the microphone. Then you're really cool. So that's what I did all weekend long. I was arguing with the World H&I chair. We didn't even have an H&I meeting in our area. So at the end of the convention, this little guy from Tennessee comes up to me. He's a friend of Larry's, and he says, you must have spoken on every one of them tapes. I thought, who is this asshole? He says, I heard you saying that you were clean and sober. I said, yeah, I'm, physically clean from drugs and emotionally, spiritually sober. He says, I looked up the dictionary definition of the word sober, and it means somber, serious, moderate, and not drunk. He said, and I can't afford to limit my recovery that way. He said, and I looked up the dictionary definition of the word clean, and it means free from dirt and disease. And he said, when I came in here, I was a dirty and diseased guy. He said, and I go to NA not only to get physically clean from drugs, but emotionally clean, spiritually clean in the way I deal with the world, clean on the inside, He said, where do you find your, recovery? I said, well, I go to the NA meetings I can get to, but I work in treatment. I'm recovery man, I work in treatment. I have the keys to the van. Oh, it's so easy to look cool when you're standing next to somebody who's puking on his shoes. Keep coming back, buddy, it gets better. Pretty soon you'll have quality recovery like me. 2-year wonder, He said, all my life I never made a commitment anywhere. I never made a decision and stuck it out anywhere. He said, if I didn't like this group of friends, I'd go cross town to that group. If I didn't like this girl, I had another one over here. If I didn't like this school, I'd get my parents to move me to that one. He said, I never made a commitment and stuck it out. He said, you need to decide where you're going to recover. I don't care which one. Make a decision and get off the fence. He said, now, if they need a speaker for the Tuesday AA meeting, would you be missed? I said, of course not. There's 100 people there. He said, well, if they needed somebody to chair NA on Friday, how about that? I said, well, there's only 6 of us. He said, you need to make a commitment and stick it out. And when the service stuff gets difficult, you can't take your ball and go home. You have to grow up. You know what I said to him? Thanks for sharing, buddy. Got the hell away from him. Went back home. Guess where I was the Tuesday? Sitting in my noon AA meeting. Tell me I can't be here. I just picked up my 2-year gold coin. Who the hell does he think he is? And the topic was like humility or something. And they picked on me. And I said, my name's Kermit. I'm a drug addict. And I was still using adjectives. And I said, I spoke on the topic. I never talked about my drug use there because it was a violation of their traditions. At the end of the meeting, this old drunk comes up to me. He says, we don't talk about drugs in here. And I said something like, you stay sober, I stay clean. Maybe we'll both make it, buddy. And he marched out the door. Guess where I was the next day? Back at that noon meeting. Tell me I can't be here. And I'm sitting in this meeting and I'm sitting there and I'm stewing, and I hear this little quiet voice in my head and says, what are you doing here? And I thought to myself, resentment? And the little voice said, is that any reason to attend a 12-step fellowship? And I thought, no. And I got up out of that noon AA meeting in 1983, and I made a commitment to only go to Narcotics Anonymous for my recovery. And the next time I saw that jerk from Memphis, Tennessee, I asked him to be my sponsor because I wanted what he had to offer. Because he talked to me about integrity. He talked to me about putting my money where my mouth is, And there was something that happened. There was a profound change that began to happen when we started to bet our lives on NA. If you wonder why NA isn't growing or it doesn't grow where you live or why it's grown somewhere else a lot bigger, somebody has to bet their life on NA. Because once you do that, you can't go there. If you're going somewhere else all the time and the NA screws up, well, fuck it. We just got 50 other meetings over here. But when you bet your life on something, you're going to do everything that it takes to make it to work.
All right now.
And the other thing is that when somebody asked me to sponsor them, they had to do what I did, So I went to 7 meetings a week. They had to go to 7 meetings a week, and then the people they sponsored, so it just started to grow. We had a lot of people going to meetings all of a sudden, I had an emotional bottom at 5 years. I was on all levels of service, hadn't worked steps at all, really, and I was nuts, And I remember I went to the Virginia convention, and I knew I had to change something. I wasn't speaking to Joseph but about once a month, and when you only talk to your sponsor once a month, you only have to be honest once a month. And, there was this guy there named Mike, and he was just a real spiritual guy. He was just quiet, humble kind of guy, and he was a natural leader. And I saw him on the steps, and I went up to him, and he knew I was going to argue about something because I was a purist radical, and I was always up in everybody's face about something, and he was on the program committee or something. And I hadn't done this for a while, I looked up at him and I said, Mike, would you be my sponsor? And tears came up in his eyes. And he said, I'd be honored to be your sponsor. Honored. He said, where are you at with these steps? I said, I don't know, 7, 1. You tell me, I'm lost. He said, what's the last thing you did? I said, well, I sent off the first 3 steps to Joseph. He said, great, we're going to do a 4th step. I said, all right, I can screw off for a year now. Go ahead, give me that pamphlet with the 5,000 questions about your mom's sex life and everything. He said, no, I just want you to write 3 things. I said, really? He said, yeah. Resentment, sex, and fear. I said, I can do that in a sentence. I'm resentful and fearful that my wife won't give me sex. Can I go? He said, no. He said, we're going to make an appointment for a 5th step. I said, a what? He said, an appointment. He said, yeah, 4th step's really 9 and 20. I said, 9 and 20? He says, yeah, 9 months to worry about it and 20 minutes to write it. He said, I'll give you about 3 weeks, you'll worry about it, and you'll start writing. I hate when they have the right answers here, So that's what he did. He made an appointment. It's the best thing that ever happened to me, And there's some magic about writing, I was typing away, and I started to write about my older sister. And I wrote, I felt abandoned when Georgie left home. And I started to cry. And that was like from 20 years ago, And a lot of anger came up. I'd sponsor this guy in Istanbul, Turkey, and he's running around pissing everybody off, all the NA people, all the people at work. He calls me up, I'm so mad, I can't believe it, I'm doing all this stuff. I said, Kermit, I said, are you writing your 4th step? I said, yeah. I said, you're angry. He said, yeah. He said, good, you're doing it right. If feelings are coming up, it's working, So I went to do my 5th step with him. The best story I ever heard about a 5th step, this guy doing a 5th step with a sponsor, and the sponsor says, just read what's on the paper and add to it. And the guy's reading and adding and reading. 8 hours later, he's finally finished, and the sponsor said, well, is that it? And the guy said, yep, that's it. He said, you sure? He says, yep, that's it. He said, you sure? He says, yep, nothing else. He said, good. He said, well, give me a hug. I'll see you at the meeting. And the sponsor starts to leave the sponsor's apartment. He gets almost to the door, and he yells back, I fucked the chicken! And the sponsor yells back, did yours die too? There are only so many things that the human mind and body can perform, and honey, we've done them all. And if you think your stuff is so weird, forget it. We got, I told him all about my chickens, and then he told me about his, and I went, oh, you're sick. He said, and so are you, and that's why we're working these steps. And at the end of that inventory process, he took my 4th step and he rolled it up in a ball, and he held it in front of my eyes. And he said, not forever, and not for always, but at this moment in time, are you entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character? Not forever, but just right now. All this pain, all this hurt. And I looked at him and I said, yeah. And we bowed our heads and we shared that willingness with God. And we went back to his front lawn of his apartment in Virginia Beach, and got down on our knees, him Christian, me Jewish, and we put that pile of papers in the ground and we lit it on fire, and we humbly asked God to remove our shortcomings. And I'd like to say, if you get real spiritual and write all this stuff on a piece of paper and light it on fire, all your resentments will be gone. Addicts will be gone, here, burn this, burn this. It says, no, the seventh step says that they will be removed through action and prayer. And the process for me in those steps was just that everything that I was trying to hide had become real to me, because I'd written about it, I'd shared it with my sponsor, and every time I tried to act on it, it would hit me like a 2x4. Oh, let's spend on the credit card. Yeah, but you're paying 7 of them off. Boom. Let's go lust after that woman after the dance. Yeah, but you went home 15 times by yourself. Boom. It got too painful, I made a list of all persons that I'd harmed and went over with my sponsor and went off to make my amends. And I went to make amends to my first wife, and you'd think that, we had that little boy, and he was 2 months old at the time. And I was getting scripts from doctors, and I was eating pills regularly. She was 17 years old. And one night I came home with my bottle of whatever, and I took my usual 3 and went to bed. And she took the whole bottle and got in bed next to me. She didn't know what to do. And she fell off the bed and hit her head on a glass table and started screaming in a blackout for her life. And I woke up and I got her to the hospital with my dad. And you'd think, out of all the amends I had to make, that was the toughest one. But the one I said to her that was the exact nature of my wrong was that I never allowed you to be right ever. That was the exact nature. My 10th step is a little different, In the 9th step, we make amends to other people. My 10th step is an amends to me. In my 10th step, I go back and I heal me. And I go back and look at my childhood and I get all that stuff out. Let me tell you about my household. Here's our theme music. Doodle-doo, doodle-doo, doodle-doo. Insanity. I had a stepmother. I had a little brother who fell out a window by accident, and my stepbrother died at 5 years old. My stepmother started drinking herself to death from that day, and it took her 20 years to do it. And my father left home at an early age. He was a workaholic. My mother was crazy. As soon as my father left, she let the animals go to the bathroom all over the house, and nobody cleaned up after them. And I was left to be an adult at age 12. My ex used to say, whenever we'd leave my family's house, she'd say, "It's a miracle you've come as far as you have coming from this." My 11th step, it says, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us. Only God's will. Only. So that tells me that I'm about God's business. And what's God's business? God's business is to heal others and to be present for the miracle. And the miracle is whenever love comes to the surface. That's why 11 falls right into place with 12, having had a spiritual awakening. It's interesting, I got a copy of Bill Wilson's 12 steps that he wrote. He wrote the 12 steps and then he handed them to 100 alcoholics to review them. And it's real cool because the 12 steps says, having had a spiritual experience as the result of this course of action, we tried to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice these principles. See, Bill knew that once you have a spiritual awakening, you be there for anybody. You be there for anybody. I went to the first Virginia Convention of Narcotics Anonymous, and I met a guy from Connecticut. And this guy, his name was Danny. And I said to him, Danny, I got a couple of real good sick ones up in Connecticut for you. I got this sister and her husband, and they're nuts. And I gave him a phone number. And he went back up there and he dropped a dime, And he called my sister. And my sister, using addict, said, yeah, man, we're cool, We're not going to go down to the Avenue anymore. Michael just got out of a 3-year bid in jail, and, we're not going to go down to the Avenue. We're going to send someone else down. Yeah, right. And of course, a week went by, and Michael's down on the Avenue, and he gets busted. And my sister picked up the phone, and she called that guy, Danny, and he got her to a meeting. And she kicked in her bathtub. And this January, she celebrated 15 years clean in Narcotics Anonymous. Yeah. I've got a younger brother who's got 9 years clean. My father's girlfriend's got 12 years clean. And I was the black sheep of the family. Tell me. I got a stepmother who 4 years ago hemorrhaged and bled to death in an apartment by herself. And I got a brother who's been in and out of 11 treatment centers. And 2 years ago we buried him because he died from AIDS. And he was my running partner. And I got clean a year before he contracted the virus. So it's only a miracle that I'm standing up here clean and in my right mind. Only a miracle. Only a gift of God in Narcotics Anonymous. And that little 5-year-old boy that I had to scream at, he's 25 years old. He doesn't use drugs. He's humble. He's honest. He's grateful. And that's a gift that Narcotics Anonymous gave me. And when I'm asked to do anything for NA, I will do whatever it is. I don't have the balls to say no. If I carried this message every day for the rest of my life, I would never repay the debt of gratitude that I owe to the Fellowship of NA. And I'm going to end with a little song. Hope you're open-minded. And it sums up everything that I believe about Narcotics Anonymous. It's called The Last Time I Saw Michael. And I heard it at that convention in Georgia in 1982, 83. Someone introduced us somewhere, I don't remember now. I guess we started talking, but I don't know what about. Michael was from Florida, by way of NYC, and from that moment on, he became a friend to me. Well, I always used to see him, and sometimes we'd drop by, and every time he'd be alone, just trying to get high. The high was never high enough. He tried day after day, and helplessly I watched his spirit simply slip away. God, he used to sit and brag the money and the dope he had, but I just can't forget how sad Michael looked to me. Well, I read the evening papers, they called it heart attack, but I know damn full and well he overdosed on smack. So now the party's over. They've gone and rented out his space. I never will quite forget the look on Michael's face. God, he used to sit and brag the money and the dope he had, but I just can't forget how sad Michael looked to me. Well, I'd like to say in closing, the story's sad but true, and somewhere lives a Michael in me and all of you. And I am deeply grateful for what I have today, because I would be where he is if it wasn't for NA. Thanks.